yeah.
Wait till it comes.
Okay. I hope you can deal with my accent. I'm going to talk about something entirely different, and I'm going to talk about something about the history of occupational health, with particular reference to female workers in terms of outwork and the sweated labour debate. And I'm going to try and explain that a lot of the problems that we're now experiencing, we have been down that path before and we should have known better. So I'm going to put historically precarious work into historical context. It is not new. I'm going to then very briefly mention some of the other evidence, but I'm mainly going to concentrate on the sweated labour debate, and then I'm going to draw some parallels with contemporary policy discourses to point out that even the policy debates are not particularly new. I am going to flick through some slides very rapidly. Do not worry, my presentation will be available for you to read, and there is one or two very complicated tables which I'm just going to make 2 points about, so don't worry about them, don't try and take notes. In the post-war period in rich countries, the experience was of full-time ongoing employment was seen as the typical or standard job, hence the definition of non-standard as the opposite to that. Of course, it didn't include many women who were still in non-standard, atypical, irregular, precarious employment. It was underpinned by Keynesian full employment policies, which actually created a greater labour shortage, and the welfare state, which put labour in a much stronger bargaining position, in particularly with the unions being much stronger, and having maintained a long campaign to actually reduce insecure work over many decades before that, something which is actually forgotten. This system didn't spread globally, and in fact, from the early 70s it began to break down with the rise of neoliberalism, which in the 19th century was called laissez-faire. Neoliberalism is just another word for letting the markets and larger elements of capital dictate social relationships. And it's back, and I can guarantee you that if we actually manage to solve this problem, it'll come back under another name someday in the future. So what is happening now is there's a growth of wealth concentration, inequality, and precarious and informal work. The rise of informal work now, which is now called the new world of work, and it isn't new, is a return rather to work arrangements which existed before the Second World War. And we can date back at least several centuries. There are differences between the periods in terms of some of there wasn't large-scale movements of foreign workers on a temporary basis in earlier periods, but there are many more similarities in terms of subcontracting chains, home-based work, remote work, those sorts of things. Now, the adverse health effects of these types of employment were actually quite carefully and substantially documented in a range of countries. Canada, Australia, Britain, France, the USA, and I'm only going to talk about Britain here because I'm Australian. I decided I wasn't going to look at Australia for once, so I was going to look at Britain. But you could make many of the same points, in fact identical points, looking at other countries, and the evidence is there for those countries too. So this evidence has largely been ignored. It comes in forms of government inquiries and commissions into sweating, child labour, navvies, that was a term for casual workers building railways and canals, shop workers and factory workers. There were inspectorates producing reports. In Australia, arbitration commissions produce reports. In Europe and in the United States, medical journals and health journals such as the Lancet produced a lot of information on this, and I'm going to quote from some of those. Unions were very active, mobilising with social groups, Christian socialists and other groups in the sweating debates and this is where the reforms came, and that's the parallels with last night. And even the media got involved to some extent with exposés. Now, this is the one I'm not going to talk about, so I'm going to flick on. That one was just telling you that there is a lot of evidence relating to seamen and dock workers, which I've already published on and which are available at the end of the presentation, and they can be downloaded off my ResearchGate site for free. So I'm now going to concentrate on sweated labour. What is sweated labour and sweating and sweatshops? It refers to a concept where people are worked so long and so hard for such a small wage that it is virtually impossible to more than barely sustain themselves, if that. And so that's where the phrase comes from, and it was widely used in the 19th century and the late 20th century, and the early 20th century, and that's where the phrase sweatshop, still used today, comes from. It wasn't just in garment making. It was spread across a whole range of activities: boot making, leather goods, cigars, a whole variety of things. So the sweating reports don't just deal with garment making. And in fact, how dock work got discovered was they went in looking at garment workers and found they were actually supporting dock workers, and that's why they got interested in dock work. So women led the way. It usually, and this is the return to what's contemporary, almost invariably entailed elaborate, what has been called cascading subcontracting, multi-tiered subcontracting, which is another phrase to describe it, often involving piecework or payment by results and intense competition for work. And as I've already made the point, this work in garment making was significantly involved women and families and children. It got into the popular literature as well from the 1840s. There's a poem by Tom Hood called Song of the Shirt, and I think you can read that. You can get the gist. It was about a female shirt maker who worked at home. But there's a lot of other popular literature who actually dealt with these sorts of issues. A Little Match Girl and Alton Locke's novel. A novel by the guy who wrote Water Babies. So now I'm not going to go through that one. That's another one just about how women were actually often doing this work in supporting family incomes. The main health effects of this type of work were fatigue, exhaustion and sleep deprivation. Well, hey, that's not new. Poor diet, malnutrition and wasting diseases. Nutrition and eating habits are now becoming a problem in our society, and there's some parallel here. We don't have malnutrition so much, but there are some real problems. Cramped posture and strain injuries, disorganised workplaces, overcrowding, poor ventilation, unhygienic work conditions and living conditions. Of course, today, a lot of these sorts of workplaces have been moved to other countries which have lower standards. So we've just relocated the problem. Increased risk of infectious diseases, insecurity and mental well-being. Psychosocial hazards are not a new invention. And all the health problems with children, which are extensively documented. These are some quotes, or people talking about subcontracting. Florence Kelly, who wrote in the US, there's a quote there about how they had to pay for their own goods and tools and how low paid it was in the subcontracting system. The bottom report you see is the Lords Select Committee. That was a House of Lords Select Committee in 1888 to 1890 on sweated labour. It was one of a whole number of reports that were done. This quote, and I don't want you to try and read it all out, the gist of it is that irregular work means that people go from stages of idleness to that when they do get work, intense activity over very long hours at a feverish pace. And again, if you do contemporary research, you can find exactly the same pattern of people working feverishly at particular periods because their work is so erratic and their income is erratic. And of course, even then they're recognising, and that's a quote directly from the Lancet, to say that this has quite significant adverse effects, and it's very disorganised. We could have a much more rational system of work. And one of the great lies that's being told today is that we're told about systems and management and how everything is organised. And in fact, what we're seeing is a movement to very disorganised workplaces. Okay. There was some debate about fire risk and collapse of buildings. Hello, that's not a problem that we've ever had before with the Rana Plaza, and working unsupervised and hidden. That was raised last night. A lot of these workers are working in small workplaces, in flats and tenements. They're impossible to see what's actually going on. And what the mind can't see, then nice things can happen undetected. This is a particularly gruesome, well, this is actually worth reading because it describes a set of workplaces and how nasty they are, and the overflowing water closets. The one water closet that a whole group of workers, male and female, can use, and no light. You can imagine the stench and the noxious fumes and the overcrowding. Having 108 square cubic feet for each work person. So they're describing the physical layout of these workplaces in quite a lot of detail. There's a lot of this. That's just one example. Is that enough time, Karen? Or the other side of it is that this is a quote again from the Lancet about the impact of the work. The workers became so starved and exhausted that they must sort of soon victim fall to the wasting disease. I think they're referring to tuberculosis there. And that they're arguing that the current political economy has to be overridden to do something about this. We just can't debate political economy. We can't debate things like red tape and regulatory burden. I think this is another. Now, this is the case again. It's probably worth reading. This woman was doing work. Her wages would not cover living on bread and jam and tea. She couldn't. She was actually going into debt. And she had eventually attempted suicide, which was a criminal offence in the 19th century, and they let her off because of the circumstances. So psychosocial hazards are not a new occurrence. And you might think this is pretty extreme, but there's been some research done with FIFO workers and suicide and fly in, fly out. So we have some work practices today that can lead people to commit suicide. And work-related suicide is a very significant issue. I'm on a body dealing with the construction industry. In construction and mining today, road transport, very high rates of suicide. And because of the precarious work and the long hours. This is a spillover effects. One of the things that really got people interested was that when you had people working at home and there was very poverty, there was a lot of disease, scarlet fever and other infectious diseases, typhoid, and they actually infected the clothing. People were sleeping on the clothing while it was being made or rubbed, and they wouldn't report the disease outbreaks, because if you reported a disease outbreak, then they would close the area down and you wouldn't have any work or income. And also the tenement owners tended to bribe the health inspectors to stay away. So there was a really strong emphasis to try and stop reporting of infectious diseases, and as a result of that, some of this clothing was sold at high-end places, and notable citizens died. And this is terrible, you know, when notable citizens die as a result of a production system. And it was one of the things in the report that it eventually caused intervention. And there's a lesson here about raising an issue that causes broader public awareness and concern, particularly amongst the notable ends. This is the other evidence is James Squire, as a London physician, pointing to the link between the work and poverty and the spread of tuberculosis, which, by the way, is starting to make a reappearance for various reasons. So it was a really significant health issue in the 19th century. These are just some quotes. You don't need to read them. They're basically showing that the situation existed in other countries, including cape makers in New York, Germany. I could have got Canadian quotes. It's Australian quotes. And the other interesting thing about this was that one of the other effects of subcontracting at this time was food adulteration and subcontracting of the food system, and it was very parallels with the European horse meat scandal. If you actually read the reports, the same sort of issues going on about subcontracting chains and not being able to control your supply of food, and of course that exacerbated the health issues. There were some attempts to stop it, and I think this is a discussion about why subcontracting needs to be looked at as by a health issue, and I think that's an important point. They recognise it, but I just want to do one quote before I wrap up. This is one from the Lancet in 1890, and the point that's being made here, as they're saying, and it's a response to the House of Lords report, which they found very anodyne, in other words, a wimpy. The evidence is really stark. The findings, this never happened in politics before, the findings are very wimpy, you know. Well, this is a problem, but, oh, gee, it looks a bit hard. And what they're actually saying, and this is a point we should apply both at the national and global level, is howsoever a product is produced or a service is produced for the community has a right to say and a duty to have some say in the conditions under which that is produced. So if it's produced in a home, doesn't matter, or offshore to India, it doesn't matter. The community has a right to say how it's produced. Now that statement is in 1890, and that shows you how long this problem's been around and how little response there has been. The whole shift, as Laurent has explained so well, has been the other way, to deny this and to try and hide this. So now, those two slides, they're just there basically to say, one, that the regulatory regime that we built and reached its high point in the around 1970, some improvements after that, is being eroded back. And so we're going back towards the 1870s, not forward, and that the situation in poor countries is actually not a lot different. They never got to the 1970 point in many cases and show no sign of getting there. And the other one simply is a table we produced on the pressure disorganised regulatory failure model for contemporary research, and we would argue is equally relevant to understanding historical research. But now I just want to make some parallels and general observations to wrap up. So the health effects of long hours, casual work and irregular low pay have been well documented 100 years ago. By 100 years ago, we knew what the problems were. And we also knew a lot about the flow-on effects of poverty and child labour, education, the sort of spillover effects on the community, and the impact between working and living conditions. And one of the interesting things I'm seeing in precarious employment research now is people are now starting to explore the relationship between working and living conditions, which Wayne has done some very good work on. Contemporary research into flexible work is rediscovering these linkages in both rich and poor countries, and I've already mentioned that point, so I won't belabour it. So there were a set of regulation and infrastructure policies that were introduced. This is the last slide. To deal with these problems, and they were dealing essentially with many of the same policy issues that exercise researchers and some policymakers today. And it's not surprising, really, because capitalism, as I've been doing a lot of historical research, and it has about 5 tools in its suit, and they just get reconfigured over the last 200 or 300 years. It doesn't come up with new... I mean, Uber is essentially an app version of subcontracting. And so they use new forms of technology, but the devices are basically the same. And there's if you've been following the US, you'll know that Uber's now looking at trucking, which is frightening. So the problem is that it's now operating more globally to find unorganised labour, and that's creating a huge challenge not only for national systems but for the labour movement everywhere. But still we can draw some important lessons from the past in terms of how to regulate these things and the importance of reminding people about history and not necessarily creating the same mistakes again. Particularly what we can learn is the broadly based mobilising of public outrage, which helped to defeat some of these things. And it was really concerns about disease that helped to basically push the anti-sweating campaign to have some major achievements. And it's a great achievement of women were very active in this movement. They get lost to history in this regard. Now, new regulative initiatives we are going to need to look at, and they were discussed last night, but we need to think about what this debate really highlights is the intersection between what people are paid, their hours of work, and their health and safety. And we need integrated labour standards to really deal with that. And thanks very much. That's it.